Dodgson, aka Lewis Carroll, is perhaps often delighted at this appraisal of feminine youth than power or anguish, though the abundance of it did fall into his work frequently. An underwhelming adolescence contributed largely to this, it seems. An overbearing father, insisting upon his clerical success, forced this artistic individual into a corner that supplanted power over the delights of youth and inspired him. Indeed, it was his anguish at being in such a corner that incited a timid and fearful character to rise to new horizons. The power he found cultivated into a fervent pursuit of photography, lexicology, philosophy, poetry, mathematics, technology, and of course writing. Most famous, of course, is the most enlightening fairy tale of all time, Alice's Adventures Underground, or Wonderland. Born in Manchester during the Industrial Revolution, of all times for genius to thrive, Charles and his 10 siblings only managed to survive into adulthood by the luck of being the right class. Now, Dodgson's father was an Anglican priest, and it was expected of him that he would follow the same line of career. Priesthood was less of an option and more of a given in the eyes of his parents. However, upon recognising his own talent, Charles made his way to university with some little disgruntled family behind him. His early studies, history of our species, were tumultuous, especially of someone of Charles's part of the country and class. Oxford held, and still does to some greater degree, I suppose, well, a large degree anyway at least, the distinction of being so elitist that even those from elite backgrounds are considered lowbrow and unworthy. Studies have shown that children and adolescents who exhibit high levels of externalizing behaviors that include aggression, hyperactivity, or disruption are often victims of social exclusion. It is possible at this point to draw out this article with a long study of my own about Charles's early childhood influences, and indeed I intend to confine my musings to the initial scope which started here, that of power, and the seclusion it draws from, particularly in Dodgson. The elitist nature that was forementioned exemplifies the oppressive culture of the English even today. Whereof our cousins over the pond consist to focus more on race relations to a greater degree than we, the English have more of a class struggle than counterparts. This too can stem from an estrogen-based reactionary system in society rather than one based on logical consistency, which Charles was predominant. Which brings us neatly back to his father, who was so mega conservative that he even named his son after himself. Although Dodgson plunged on through his study, regardless of the contempt shown by his contemporaries directed at his foppish behaviour. The boyish look Charles had, along with his locks of long hair and very dapper deportment, all of this did little to elevate his position. Now, upon meeting the Liddles of Christ Church College, Cambridge, in January 1856, at a performance of nursery rhymes at a school called Croft, of which he was entertaining, he had a tea party afterwards, in which he checked his watch constantly in an effort to be more punctual. And this showed signs of autism and an OCD characteristic. It can also be an indicator of chronophobia, which was definitely a symptom which could be attributed to Charles. The world was starting to evolve and advance, and at an astonishing rate at this time, and Dodgson was always in a desperate rush not to be left behind. Now, Pamela M. Lee, in her book Chronophobia, said, "With structuralism came the awareness that history and time, as a form of writing, is by its nature topical and interpretative, and something does not readily subscribe to in the mid-1800s. Perhaps this was why Charles eventually found himself drawn to narcotics of varying descriptions. Opium was one, of course, and laudanum. Now, but the most potent of drugs that he indulged in was his own enthusiasm for the mythical and the fantastic. Such an occupation took up much of his waking hours. It might have been his homeschooling which contributed to this ineptitude. Well known, though, it is that home education is more effective. A lack of social interaction between contemporaries seems to have detrimentally affected Dodgson's natural autistic tendencies. Flitting into a dream world, whether slightly distracted by someone over his shoulder. People have been known to relate this symptom to microscopia. Things seem smaller than that which they are, or Alice in Wonderland syndrome. An explanation very simplistic for the originator of such a condition. Now, however, it's also simplistic to put down Dodgson's symptoms as a result of just one cause. In cases related to symptoms of autism, the results were telling, both in relation to Charles and Alice herself, perhaps. Camille Gisai postulated that, among men, a diagnostic delay inversely correlated with verbal communication inflexibility and adherence to routine in young girls and women. It correlated with an excessive attention to detail and verbal skills. Dodgson's stammer couldn't have helped much either. This could have wildly contributed to his foundling love for the newfound art of photography, again alluding to the symptom of chronophobia. Charles's photographs of the little sisters were very much focused on the themes of the time and essence that seemed to predominate his every waking hour. The feeling that the years were out of control, or at least his control. Death was always around Charles and his work, certainly. The infamous portrait of Alice as a street urchin. He liked to remind the viewer that youth was only ever as transient as those who perceived it, desperately clinging on to the past while dragging it to the future. A very maternal trait, although death was very much consistent to the Victorian Gothic at the time, appraising the fashion of the day, as well as himself. He enjoyed order in a world of disorder, perhaps a trait carried over his overbearing father. This exemplified his abhorrence of rugby when at school. Of course, that led him to his speciality of tenure, which is mathematics. However, despite his achieved academic success, it has been suggested that if he was intimately associated with the Little Sisters, his position of a simple college dun would never have amounted to much in the dean's eyes, at least. This, despite their copious presents to the children. But it has to be mentioned that almost half the photographs he made were of his adult friends, a fact that is hardly ever taken into consideration today. It has been stated by Professor George M. Rielmter that application of testosterone-suppressing drugs and its effects on sexual behaviour are reported goes a long way to supporting the theory that Charles' propensity towards his youthful exuberance was unlikely to be deviant, just dubious. He was once asked if children bore him, and he responded, "They're 3/4 of my lives." And he also added after that, which was showed a discrepancy between the two opinions, you know. It's like, he said, "I have never yet met a young lady whose company I could endure for a week." Now, insofar as courting is concerned and marriage, this created the aforementioned discrepancy. That in itself would take a whole nother article up, to be quite honest with you. But it was the 4th of July in 1862 when Dodgson decided to take the children up the Thames to Godstow rather than towards Christchurch, as was their custom when on such excursions. All the way, trickling of Charles's mind recalled Tolkien's recent work, The Lord of the Rings, which had recently been published. Probably because they also frequented the same tavern, I suspect. Although fanciful nature of the story appealed to him greatly as he told the tale of Alice's adventures underground to the little children. Now, it had been conjectured that legality swept into the Alice books, Wonderland and Looking Glass. His lavish structure and form held tight as he maintained a stronghold on youth and femininity. This stronghold highlighted the power Charles often still sought to control his own femininity. The psychologist Mikhail Voltnov asserted sexual orientation is a strong association with areas primarily linked to processing and integrating incoming sensory, reward-related and motor information. The case of Who Stole the Tarts? Although looked at through a child's parody, all through the conduit of Alice's expectations. So, was Dodgson, or Lewis Carroll, mad? Now Mrs. Hargreaves. Alice deeply disillusioned him, although that did not hinder their correspondence. Though, in his later books, Sylvie and Bruno, for example, took on a different trend to that of the inherent of the innocence he so admired, blowing with the literary wind of the late 1800s that childhood innocence in children was gone, and the harsh light of adulthood became more popular. This tended to indicate a more realistic mind in the author, and consequently madness as we imagine it. It's hardly applicable. Now this despite the fact that one of his last works, The Hunting of the Snark, was thoroughly imbued in mythology and poetical imagery. Madness cannot be defined in its femininity, it seems, nor in its flights of fancy, but more in its logical consistency, which shows the power of which we are all guilty. As such, are we all power mad in our insanity? Or do we reside in the rabbit hole of our own making? Now, I don't actually know the answer to that one. Neither would I attempt to even postulate it. Give us a good clicking.
Shakanaka.